What I want to start doing today is talking about a different sort of revolution, an economic revolution that starts in Britain in the middle of the 1700s and is going to have a profound impact on the balance of power around the world. It's what we call now the Industrial Revolution. And to illustrate just how dramatic a change the Industrial Revolution ushers in, let's think about it this way. Before 1800, before the year 1800, the majority of the world's manufactured goods, that is, things that were made from raw materials into finished goods by whatever process, the majority of those come from two places in the world, India and China. Textiles, pottery, silk, all of these things, woven, constructed, shaped, forged, whatever you want to say, the majority of the world's manufactured goods come from two places, India and China. After 1800, the vast majority of the world's manufactured goods are going to come from northwestern Europe. And Britain, from the early 19th century through the First World War, is going to be, as some people called it, the workshop of the world. It will produce the vast majority of industrially made goods, the vast majority of manufactured goods of any state or of any economic power in the world. It's going to be a dramatic remaking of the economic balance of power, because the control of industrial technology, the expansion of industrial technology, the massive export of manufactured goods out of Europe in particular in the early and mid-19th century is going to overwhelm even the domestic manufacturing found in places like China and India. That is, Indian weavers, for example, who in the 1600s and 1700s had made a fairly good living supplying both their domestic customers and weaving goods for export, so that groups like the East India Company might send back calico or cotton woven cloth with intricate designs back to Britain, back to the rest of Europe. These Indian weavers are going to suffer dramatically, because by the middle of the 19th century, India will be swamped, almost literally, almost buried, in imported cotton cloth. Industrialization dramatically remakes the way in which people make things. So much so that by the middle of the 19th century, a factory in northern England can produce a good, ship it, market it in a place like India, and still undersell, that is, still sell for a lower price than domestic manufacturers in India, driving them ultimately, or all but a few of them, out of business. One element in the eventual revolt that will come against the rule of the East India Company in 1857 in India, one element in that revolt is going to be the growing economic destitution of North Indian weavers, whose livelihoods will disappear as the Industrial Revolution begins to, in essence, sort of undercut their own markets and their own sort of indigenous position in a place like India. So it's a dramatic change. It's going to dramatically change the relationship between the rest of the world and Europe and, in some respects, North America. As industrialization progresses, you're going to have sort of a two-tier system emerging. Those states which produce manufactured goods through industrialization, and those states which serve either to consume those goods, or, and sometimes both, or to provide the raw materials necessary for this industrialization. Cotton in the early 19th century, through at the end of the 19th century, things like rubber and copper. So you have a dramatic transformation in the relationship of these states. What you have basically is an exponential growth or the exponential increase in the power which European states are beginning to exercise over other parts of the world. That is, by the 1750s, early 1800s, and we've talked about European expansion east and west, colonial expansion, colonial conquest, has already begun to change the relationship between these various parts of the world. Industrialization intensifies that change dramatically. It takes it to another level. Not only do you have these European states acting as colonial powers, but now, that is in terms of military expansion, political control, but now you also have the massive economic advantages which industrialization brings, and that accrue to this, again, this sort of select group of powers in the early and middle 19th century. The question I want to deal with today is, how does this happen in Britain? What is it about Britain that makes it the first industrial nation? Why does Britain become the first industrial nation? To think about some of the factors that go into it, and to think also about not only how industrialization changes the relationship between various parts of the world, or various parts of the world to each other, but also the way industrialization starts to change the way people think about their lives, about their work, about abstract concepts like time itself. But let's start with a little bit of a sort of description of how and why Britain becomes the first industrial power. Now, if you talk to people in Britain in the middle of the 19th century, many of them would have said, well, it's because we're British. We are just sort of, in some senses, divinely ordained, or in some ways sort of culturally and intellectually superior, so that we industrialized first. It's a sign of the superiority of British civilization. That's not the case. That's not the case. There are certain things that people in Britain, individuals in Britain, will do very well that will aid in the rise of industry. But what you have in Britain in the middle of the 18th century, that is starting in the 1750s, is the coming together of a significant number of changes and circumstances that allowed Britain to industrialize first. It may sound strange to talk about industrialization in this way, but what happens in Britain is almost an organic industrialization. It's not directed by anyone, by the state or by a bank or by one investor. Rather, industrialization emerges out of the confluence of a variety of factors, of the coming together of a variety of things in Britain in the 1750s. So it is as much to do with natural resources, timing, luck, in fact, as it is, and it's much more to do with those, than anything sort of innately British or innately English or Scottish about the people who embarked upon this industrial revolution. It is the coming together of a variety of circumstances which produce this massive change in how people not only produce goods, but in how people see the world and organize themselves both economically and politically. There are several elements. The first, in the rise of Britain to industrial preeminence, the first is this. Britain in the 1600s and early 1700s underwent not an industrial revolution, but what you might call an agricultural revolution. British agriculture became dramatically more productive and more efficient from the late 1600s through the 1700s, due to a variety of things. And by more productive, what I mean is that even though the British population rose over the course of the 1700s, increased, agricultural productivity also increased, so that food prices remained stable. Food producers were able to make a profit, but people were not bankrupted in order to feed themselves. That is, food production kept up with population growth to such an extent that food prices remained stable and fairly low, and producers landowners, farmers, etc., were still able to make money out of agriculture. It's a revolution really in productivity and efficiency. And it has to do with a couple of things. One is in the 1600s and early 1700s, a time in which population was not increasing rapidly. In order to maximize their profits, many landowners and farmers began to experiment with new techniques and new technologies for growing food and for grazing animals, grazing livestock like cattle. There's a couple of famous ones. This perhaps is the most famous. I don't know if you can, hopefully you can make this out, but if you were to fly over the English countryside today, and this is particularly an English phenomenon, but to fly over it or see it from aerial photographs, you would notice that the land is divided into all these sections with hedgerows and walls and fences. This is a product of the late 1600s and early 1700s. It's a movement known as enclosure. And it fundamentally transforms the land. It may seem sort of obvious, but people start to realize if I close off a field, or close off and section off my land, I can graze the cattle in one pasture, I can graze the sheep in another, and I can grow things in the third without the cattle and the sheep wandering over to eat what I'm trying to grow. That is, you might say, well, it took a long time to figure that one out. But the tradition in England had been, you farmed sort of land in the open. You grew wheat, you grew vegetables, you grew barley, things like that. You grazed your animals. Enclosure means now you can grow things without risk of losing these crops. You can rotate fields more efficiently. That is, rotate crops through fields. Use fields at times for agriculture, at times, times for cultivation, at times for livestock grazing. You can rotate, for example, cattle and sheep through fields that even after they've eaten everything in it, not only have they eaten it, but of course they've fertilized it. If you need to know how, there's a different place, I'm sure, for that. But you have a rise in productivity simply in this. You are not losing crops to your livestock. You are, in fact, concentrating your cultivation, making it more intensive. And you're not only doing that, but you're also using new techniques to farm. People are beginning to try to breed hybrid crops. Stronger strains of wheat, for example, that you can grow and experiment with growing in small areas, see how it works, and then perhaps expand that kind of cultivation. You have technological expansion. Perhaps the most famous, for those who enjoy early 80s arena rock, is the invention of a man named Jethro Tull. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Anyone heard of Jethro Tull besides John here? Okay, so we've got 2, 3, sort of, very aggressive flute playing, sort of. If you like Rush and you like Jethro Tull, well, you're probably a very interesting person. But Jethro Tull is in fact a farmer in Britain. And in the 1730s, he invents something called the seed drill. The seed drill. The traditional way of sowing a field had been hand sowing. That is, you plowed the field, plowed it into furrows. You could walk up and down the furrows individually planting seeds, but that would take you forever. Or you simply scattered the seeds, hoping for the best. Yes, you'd get some crops, but birds might take some of the seeds as food. The wind might blow some off. A heavy rain, you might wash some of the seeds off. What Jethro Tull invented was this implement that you used. You had a draft horse or a pair of oxen or something, and you pulled this large cylinder that had, it looks like, sort of 3-inch, not quite spikes, but almost sort of dowels, hollow tubes protruding from it. You filled the cylinder with seed, and then you rolled it over the land you had plowed and prepared for cultivation. And what it did was, it planted the seeds at a uniform depth of, say, 3 to 4 inches in the field. Many more you allowed, basically, for much greater cultivation. That is, many more seeds now turned into crops. Because, of course, you had buried them. They were not going to be washed away, blown away, or eaten. And so simply by doing that, you have a dramatic rise in agricultural productivity. So it's an agricultural revolution. Everything from crop hybrids to inventions like culls to the enclosure of fields. In order to make agriculture even more profitable, farmers expanded their their infrastructure. They built roads, oftentimes privately funded roads that were called turnpikes, where literally, you had a log, a pike, something blocking the road that you turned if you paid a fee to use it. And you had canals, where horse-drawn barges could bring a large amount of one type of produce or another to market towns. You have expansion of canals, expansion of roads. You're creating a much larger, you might say, economic infrastructure in Britain. And all of this is contributing to keep agriculture productive and food prices relatively low. The agricultural revolution has a dramatic impact on what's going to happen in Britain from the mid-1700s on, in several ways. In the first place, the fact that agriculture is so productive means that food prices never get astronomically high. That means that ordinary people, over the course of the 1700s, actually have money to spend on things besides, you might say, the staples of life. Food, shelter, clothing, heat. That is, food prices remaining stable allow people to have more discretionary income. Especially in a Britain that is becoming wealthier because of the amount of trade coming in and out of Britain from its colonies, whether in the Atlantic or in Asia. In fact, what you see growing in the 1700s in Britain is a consumer culture, where people are now demanding and have the ability to purchase new clothes, drapes, newspapers, and books. It's no coincidence that this is when the novel really is invented in Britain, because people have this appetite to consume not simply clothing or food or things that were previously seen as beyond their means, but also cultural things like newspapers, like, for example, novels by people like Daniel Defoe, the man who writes Robinson Crusoe, among other things. So you have this growth of a consumer culture, which is driven by the fact that people have some income to spend. That's the first thing. The second thing is that this agricultural revolution dramatically reshapes the labor force in Britain. Agriculture becomes more efficient, more dependent on, you might say, animal labor than human labor. And what you wind up having is a lot of people in the countryside who no longer rely on agriculture for their jobs, or can no longer rely on it. That is, agricultural innovation produces a large pool of what might be called surplus labor. People whose labor is no longer needed because of technological innovations, because crops no longer need to be so intensively weeded or protected. Livestock is now contained within enclosed fields. All of these things mean that there are fewer job opportunities in agriculture. There are lots of people now looking for other work. So you've got consumerism, you've got a labor pool or a growing pool of people who are out of one type of work and in some cases rather desperately searching for other types of work. There's a couple of other elements that we need to consider as well. Britain in the 1700s has access, ready access to cheap raw materials. Two of which I want to highlight here. The first is inside Britain itself. Britain has, especially in northern England, enormous deposits of coal. Coal that is easy to access, fairly close to the surface. People had begun, even before the 1700s, using coal to heat their homes, using coal to melt iron ore, to eventually to sort of begin to experiment with making things like steel, and not just sort of iron implements. But you have these enormous coal deposits, which are, as I said, available, easily accessible. The other thing that Britain has is that Britain has access to very cheap cotton. Does anyone know why? Or how?
America.
American cotton, North American cotton, why is it so cheap?
Slave labor.
Exactly. It's cultivated, grown by slaves. So you have raw material access of the sort that nobody else in Europe has at this time, and nobody else in the world has at this time. Energy supplies in terms of coal, raw materials for finished goods in terms of raw cotton. So you've got these various things. An agricultural change, a consumer change coming out of that, a growing pool of available labor, access to raw materials. Now that doesn't remove the human element from it, to say it's all structural. Because what happens in the middle of the 1700s is that people who have been taking advantage of this enhanced consumer demand, people in Britain who produce their own woolen textiles, for example, who may on some small scale be producing cotton textiles, who produce things like cutlery, silverware, plates, pottery, they see that there is this growing consumer demand, and they want to capitalize on it. Because this demand is already in existence, these people no longer have the sort of desire, don't only have the desire to capitalize on this, but they actually have the capital for it. People who make things in Britain in the first half of the 1700s are making money. What they want to do is make a lot more money. So what they do is they invest. In essence, they offer incentives to people who can come up with newer ways of manufacturing things, newer technologies. The Industrial Revolution in Britain is therefore mainly self-financed. That is, it is people who had owned perhaps large weaving workshops, metalworks, some very prominent artisans. These people are making money. They want to make a lot more money. But they have already the capital to go out and invest in new technologies. And it's the prospect of this enrichment, it's the prospect of making a lot more money that is the incentive that brings a lot of these new technologies about. That is, people are not simply saying, well, I'm going to sit around here, I'd like to invent the power loom, it just occurred to me one day. No, there's a direct incentive. If you can make manufacturing more efficient, you can make a lot of money, because people will pay for that invention. The scientific revolution of the late 1600s in Britain, of Isaac Newton and people like that, of Robert Boyle, which had brought about a lot of theoretical knowledge of mathematics and of physics in particular. In the early 1700s, a lot of that theory gets translated into practice. in engineering. And it's ultimately people like, for example, the inventor James Watt. In the late 1700s, who show that you can take sort of theoretical knowledge of mathematics and of physics and apply them to engineering problems and produce efficient ways now to harness the power of coal, to use steam power in particular, to make goods, to power machinery. Watt is not the person who invents the steam engine. That is, from the early 1700s, there are a variety of people exploring and trying to innovate in ways that will allow you to burn coal, heat water, create steam. What Watt is famous for, and this is why we remember him, and not people who developed sort of early steam engines about the size of this room. Watt invents what's called the efficient steam engine, which basically Watt invents a way in which a steam engine can use all of the water within it, rather than losing water to condensation and evaporation. So he creates the efficient steam engine. He's not the inventor of the steam engine. He's not the person who comes up with the concept. He is the person who refines it. And he refines it because there's a particular economic incentive for him to. As more and more people were looking to harness the power of coal, to power machinery, to produce goods more efficiently, one of the problems was coal mines, especially coal mines fairly close to the surface, they could flood fairly easily. You had to figure out how to pump water most efficiently out of the coal mines. And what Watt comes up with is an efficient steam engine that pumps water. And his model for this steam engine becomes the base for all of these other innovations. Power looms, spinning jennies to turn cotton, raw cotton into thread. All of these are, sort of the result of the application of sort of theoretical knowledge to practical problems. Why? Because there's an incentive there, a monetary incentive. So you have in Britain, over the course of the 1700s, is the coming together, as I've said, of all of these different factors. The availability of natural resources for cheap. The availability of surplus labor. That is, to start building factories and to start producing, you do need lots more people to work. But the terms for work favor the employers, not the employees, because people need the work. You have massive migrations out of the countryside into new cities, into, for example, the county in northern England known as Lancashire. Lancashire, Lancashire, whose major booming city becomes Manchester. And whose major port is an already thriving port, but one that's going to become even more important, Liverpool. So you have resources, natural resources, cheap coal, cheap cotton, and you might say cheap labor. You have a consumer disposition in Britain, and not only do you have people just sort of, you might say, disposed mentally and sort of, culturally to spend money, but they actually have the money to spend because food prices are fairly low. You have an infrastructure of roads and canals that are already speeding up ways of trading. The thing to remember is that it's not one element here, it's the combination of them all. If you take out one element, you don't get the Industrial Revolution. You could have all of these things, but if you didn't have coal easily accessible, you wouldn't have industrialization. If you didn't have cheap cotton, you wouldn't have the choice to go into textile manufacturing and make that the basis of a British industrialization. This is largely, sort of, as I said, self-finance. It arises, you might say, from the ground up, of people seeking opportunities to make more money, and in doing so, embracing new technologies, embracing innovations, but financing it themselves. Industrialization in Britain is a unique circumstance. And the word unique is people often say, oh, this is really unique, or more unique. No, unique's not comparative. Unique is something that happens once. And this is what happens in Britain. This sort of industrialization is unique. You can't copy it. Everyone else is going to want to play catch-up to British, to industrialization, to the British, trying to gain the lead that Britain has in industrialization. They can't follow the British model. It's not really a model you can copy. You can't simply say, well, let's wait around for the perfect combination of circumstances. Of raw materials, surplus labor, consumerism, etc. Every other industrializing state after Britain is going to have to do it a little bit differently. They're going to have to do it mostly deliberately and intentionally. In Britain, there's no intention, you might say. Nobody wakes up in London one day, in Westminster, in Parliament, and says, it's about time we had an industrial revolution. That doesn't happen. Instead, it sort of arises. It emerges. As I said, sort of strangely to think of it this way, but sort of organically. And the model for later industrialization in places like France and Germany and Belgium and the United States and Japan is going to be one where certain sectors within the state or within the economy are going to take the lead. Whether in the case of Germany, it's banks and investment groups who basically say, we need to organize industrialization so that we can play catch-up. In the United States in particular, it's banks. In Japan, it's going to be the state. And of course, in the early part of the 20th century, in the new Soviet Union, it's going to be the state. But the idea being that there needs to be some sort of force or some sort of actor who pushes industrialization to try to catch up to where the British are. And for Britain, the unique way in which they industrialize is, in the first place, it's sort of a, you might say, a gift because they're the first. They have this coming together of all these circumstances that allows them to enjoy this enormous advantage in the 19th century over everybody else. But it's also a limitation because there are certain things built into the British industrial model that are going to serve as sort of checks to its eventual growth. That is, because it's first and because the British enjoy so much success for so long, because they're first, they never put a lot there's never a premium put on further innovation. People will be producing cotton textiles in Manchester in 1912 in basically the same way they were producing them in 1850. People will be relying on the same markets. And crucially, there will not be a lot of further investment in industry. Industry will be seen as, basically, it's a self-financing model. Not a lot of British banks, investment houses in places like London, they're not going to invest a lot of money in industrialization. That wasn't the pattern. In fact, they stay very separate from it. For all the money that's floating around London in the 19th century, very little of it, a very small part of it, goes to investing in British domestic manufacturing. People will invest in railways being built in India, but they won't invest even, you might say, in railways at home. So you have some limitations there. There is not a premium on continued innovation. There's a tendency to sort of rest on their laurels, to be somewhat complacent. Just as, for example, the Portuguese had been in the Indian Ocean in the 1500s. They got there first, they established their dominance, but then they're cleared out by the British and the Dutch in the 1610s and 1620s because they haven't innovated. The British and the Dutch now have better ways of doing business, better ways of making contact with indigenous people, and they've got bigger, faster, and better armed ships. So you have, again, this sort of, reward for being first, but it's not enough. And Britain will discover, especially after the First World War, that having sort of taken the lead in industrialization is not the same as maintaining the lead in industrialization. Having been first doesn't mean you're always going to be first. Any questions about this? Okay, let's talk a little bit about some of the sort of impact of, or some of the effects of industrialization. Industrialization changes all sorts of aspects of British life. It changes what it means to be British, what it means to think of yourself as British. It changes your relationship to time. It changes your relationship to your work. It changes the landscape. This is sort of a classic depiction. This is a mill in Manchester. Pictures taken in the early 1900s. But it's the growth of these, large red brick, multi-chimneyed mills that is the most dramatic change to the landscape. And for many people, it's a rather startling kind of shift. And I'll give you an example so we can think about just how, how much change comes how quickly. In 1830, one of the things that the Industrial Revolution does is not only does it push forward innovations in production, it pushes forward innovations in transport. And in 1830, you get the opening of the first intercity passenger railway in the world. It is the Liverpool-Manchester, or depending on where you're from, Manchester-Liverpool Railway, which is inaugurated in 1830. It's actually September 15th, 1830. At roughly 10 o'clock in the morning, you have the inauguration of the world's first passenger railway. By 10:30, you've got the world's first fatality on a passenger railway. Because one of the things they did is they brought in a load of politicians to come ride on these various trains pulled by locomotives, most famously one called the Rocket, invented by George Stephenson, sort of the father of locomotive design. And there was a member of Parliament, don't worry about his name is William Huskisson, who was invited to ride in one of these carriages. And they were all sort of taken out for a spin, and then they were sort of halfway between Liverpool and Manchester, and they basically they pulled the trains onto some sidings, because they were going to let the Rocket, being driven by George Stephenson, sort of lead them now into, I think they were heading towards Liverpool. And of course, everyone got off the train. They pulled into a siding, and people weren't sort of, thinking, well, maybe I better stay in the train, because there might be other trains coming. People weren't really sort of conscious of how trains worked. And so Huskisson and others got out and sort of wandered around on the tracks, and here came the Rocket. And it's sort of fun because, you talk about the Rocket, and people depicted this as, this huge sort of steaming, fire-breathing locomotive that bore down at about 17 miles an hour on poor William Huskisson, who tried to get out of the way, and he tried to sort of lift himself up into a railway carriage of something on a siding, and the door swung open, and it swung him out in front of the Rocket. And it took off one of his legs. And he was rushed to a house where he was given enormous doses of what's called laudanum, which is basically opium. But yet he also managed to remain very clear-headed. He wrote his entire will while he was otherwise, you might say, sort of doped up and missing a limb and bleeding to death. And he died later that evening. And I have a picture. I forgot to put it up there. I apologize. But there's an enormous picture. There used to be a plaque on the spot on the railway where William Huskisson died, and it was one of those very Victorian sort of markers, because it didn't say in one sentence what 11 paragraphs would do. So it talked about William Huskisson, most noble member of his breed, etc., etc., felled most grievously by, this advance in locomotive technology. But this is sort of the way in which things are changing. The world can now kill you in entirely different ways. Life is now dangerous in entirely different ways. And I don't think we should underestimate the impact of how much industrialization changes the way in which people relate to the world. Because industrialization it changes the landscape. You now have massive urbanization Places like Manchester, which had a population of about 15,000 in 1750, have a population of 100,000 a century later. You have the rise of all sorts of industry. This is hard to sort of see, but this is a photo taken in the 1920s. Again, in Salford, part of Manchester, these massive sort of row houses, or tenements, or even, you might say, industrial slums, built to house the hundreds of thousands of workers who come in from the countryside. You see not only the growth of railways, but the growth of these enormous railway stations. If you've ever been to England, and you've been to London or another city, and you've been to the railway station, you see these places that are basically sort of temples of industrialization, temples of technological prowess, with steel girders and lots of light and panes of glass, with massive sort of clocks. All of these things designed to sort of enshrine progress in industry. And not just sort of, have this be sort of, a place for transportation, but almost sort of a civic religion of progress and efficiency. You have a significant dislocation for people. One of the things that contemporaries and historians have argued about is what is the impact of industrialization on people in these industrializing states. Because oftentimes it was sort of, by champions of industrialization, they said, this is the way forward, this is progress, this is great. You guys eat something back there? Okay. You have also people who say, this is terrible, this is the worst thing that ever happened. It creates this downtrodden industrial proletariat, forever to be exploited and housed in these, urban slums and decaying, or sort of, quickly decaying factory cities. It is no question, let me just skip ahead to a couple things. There's no question that this new sort of work is dislocating for people. But it's also true that what you might call sort of the social and cultural and perhaps even sort of psychological dislocation that happens is tempered to some degree by an improvement in people's material lives. So that's where I want to turn now, is thinking about the impact of industrialization, how it's framed at the time, and then what it actually means. The first thing to remember is that for many people, especially those who weren't necessarily involved in industrial production or expansion of manufacturing, they regarded industrialization as a horror. Most famous, perhaps, being the poet William Blake, who wrote this poem called Jerusalem that became a hymn, and who talked about sort of what he thought England ought to be and what England was becoming. That is, England ultimately ought to be a place of mountains green, pleasant pastures seen. England would be a green and pleasant land. But what does he see there? Dark satanic mills, or let me go back. Clouded hills, that is smoke and fog and all the sort of, byproducts of massive use of coal and industrialization. Dark satanic mills. That is, these mills, belching smoke and fire, employing thousands in this sort of permanent semi-darkness. These mills are basically hell on earth. And he's not the only one to feel this way. The writer Charles Dickens is going to write an entire novel called Hard Times about industrialization, in which he basically argues that industrialization is the product of these sort of hyper-rational, emotionally stunted manufacturers, which chews up both those who work in the mills and those who own the mills. That it produces people who are emotionally stunted, not just emotionally stunted, but are psychologically ruined. It produces people who are, sort of prize themselves upon their rationality and have no human touch, and it destroys those who try to remain human in this sort of inhuman atmosphere. And you can see how Dickens sort of feels about it. That is, when he looks at the Industrialists, Dickens is very big on names. And so Dickens looks, and with the name of the industrialist, who's sort of one of the protagonists, is Mr. Gradgrind. The name of the teacher who's supposed to educate Gradgrind's children into being good little industrialists themselves, his name is Mr. Choke'em-Child. So you have this, Dickens is not pulling any punches here. Like he'll name Scrooge and things like that in later works. But Dickens and Blake are examples of this sort of furious reaction against industry. They look at it as sort of, again, scarring the landscape and consuming people, almost quite literally, in the fires, in the pits of these dark satanic mills. This impression of, you might say, sort of the evils of industrialization does lead, in the 1830s and 1840s, to a series of, you might say, sort of political inquests or political investigations into industry. It leads to child labor laws being introduced, really for the first time. In some senses, allowing, now children under the age of 9 to escape factory work, at least temporarily, and restricting, very, very nice of them, to restrict the number of hours that 9-year-olds could work in a factory. Once you got above age 12 or so, you were pretty much, you could work 12 hours a day. But even these efforts at reform, they weren't necessarily designed to address the conditions of work. Only sort of some of we're seeing some of the more extreme effects of industrialization. That is, child labor would be reduced. There were a whole series of inquiries into coal mining, but not because of the conditions of mining, but rather one of the sort of byproducts of the heat and the sort of close conditions and the, you might say, sort of the humidity, the dampness, the really sort of terrible conditions in which some coal miners worked. That is, it became apparent in the 1830s and 1840s to some rather shocked members of Parliament that in the coal mines in places like Wales and Lancashire, people were working, men and women, really with no clothes on because it was so hot and so poorly ventilated. And that the deeper you had to go underground, you had, it was much damper. And what shocked people was not the conditions in which people worked, but that the conditions were such that both men and women were taking off all their clothes in order to work. And the remedy was to bar women from working in the mines. That is that the thing that stood out to people most about this was not the conditions of work themselves, but the fact that it was affecting both sexes, you might say, in the mines. And so the answer was simply to move the women out of the mines. And men continued to work, many of them, wearing very little clothing, well into the 20th century. They used to talk, and George Orwell famously noted this in a book he wrote about miners in the early 1930s, that miners would call earning your buttons. That is, you had to walk wearing basically, at least nothing on your upper body because of the heat and the humidity. You'd have to walk down these tunnels. You'd have to walk a mile, if not more, to get to the coal seam. And there'd be all these girders and sort of beams, especially sort of wooden beams above you in the tunnel. And as you went, the various sort of bumps or points on your vertebrae would scrape against them. And you could tell how long someone had been in the mines by basically the number of scars or buttons that he had on his back, where in essence the skin above the, what do you call them, where the vertebrae sort of jut out, had not only been sort of scabbed, but eventually just basically sort of destroyed. And so they would have this row of, basically circular marks going down your back that indicated how long you'd been in the mines. So you have, again, these reactions to industry, but they are reactions in some senses to, you might say, extremes, or what are perceived as extremes. They are reactions to what you might say sort of are an outsider's impression of industrialization. One of the things that historians have urged people to remember is that for those actually working in industry, the experience was very much a mixed bag. That while Dickens and Blake and others looked at these dark satanic mills, well, some people looked at it and said that, you know, the factories of this, and the mines are places for these great occasions of sin. It's men and women working with no clothes on. They were too tired. They couldn't have sinned if they wanted to. That is, you know, if they were going to do anything, they were going to take a nap. But you have, for the people actually working, this sort of mixed result. On the one hand, for a lot of people who had been in the countryside, where work was disappearing, where there wasn't a lot of access to non-agricultural work, for these people, industrialization, the move to the cities, actually created not only opportunity, but allowed them to live at a higher standard than they had ever lived before. That is, they had more regular wages. They had the ability to buy food. At least some of their children had the opportunity to go to school. People were able to reconstruct, or you might say sort of construct anew, a sort of civic and social life. Whether based around churches, working men's clubs, as they were called, eventually pubs and bars, various sort of social and charitable organizations. That moving to the cities didn't destroy that. That in fact, indicators of, you might say, sort of demographic improvement were there. People lived a little bit longer. Despite the fact that England, or that Britain is becoming rapidly industrializing, the fact that after 1851, over half of all people in Britain now live in cities, despite this massive move, despite the working conditions that were decried by people like Blake and Dickens, you have people living longer, you have more children surviving their first year, what's sometimes called the infant mortality rate, which is seen by many people to this day as the best indication of the health of a state. That is, what rate, what percentage of children born survive to their first birthday? Because it tells you all sorts of things about resources, about infrastructure, about access to health care. Even today, that's used. Do you know where the United States stands in infant mortality rates? The last count in the United States is 27th in the world. That is, there are 26 places where children are more likely to survive to their first birthday than this country. And apart from Singapore, you then basically have all the Scandinavian nations. You have most of Western Europe. Again, places that have placed, you might say, sort of a higher premium on certain types of infrastructure, certain types of healthcare provision, certain sort of basically provisions of things like prenatal care, which don't exist here. And the result is, you know, a country which you say, you know, we're not number one, number 27 doesn't have the same ring to it. But, you know, still beating Uzbekistan, so we got that to hold on to. But that is something that the social scientists, demographers, and others look at. They say, what is the infant mortality rate? And that'll tell you a lot about the society. So you have, in the course of the 1800s in Britain, a better infant mortality rate. That is, it's declining. More children are surviving to their first birthday. People are living a little bit longer. Despite the fact that you have this rise of industrial employment, despite the fact that you have this dramatic rise in urbanization. So some historians say, well, you know, look, if you look at this, it seems like sort of a net gain. Some would even say it's sort of an absolute gain. People have access to jobs, people have access to employment and resources which they didn't have out in the countryside. On the other hand, there are other indicators that, well, people's material lives might have improved. They do suffer a severe dislocation in this transition from, you might say, an agricultural to an industrial world. That the movement into an urbanized world, the movement into a new sort of relationship to work, is very disconcerting for people. And the historians who make that argument, or at least try to sort of temper the argument about sort of there being nothing but material improvement, they point to other indicators of what you might call social distress. That is, in these new industrial cities, you see a rise in crime, especially a rise in violent, sort of person-on-person crime, a rise in what we might today call domestic violence. You see a rise in the number of suicides, especially in these new and expanding urban areas. You see a dramatic rise in divorce. And because at times divorce was very hard to obtain, you see a rise in what was then called abandonment. You see a definite rise in alcoholism. So there are indications that for some people, well, they may be making more money. Well, this move to the city may have saved them in some ways. In other ways, it's an enormous change. Some people have real difficulty handling. Because you're moving from an agrarian lifestyle, where in essence you worked sun up to sundown. You worked in a relatively sort of recognizable seasonal pattern. You could tell when sort of, conditions were good and when perhaps you were going to have a lean year. You could read things. Amount of rainfall, amount of sunshine, freezing temperatures. You could sort of plan at least a little bit ahead. The industrial world is very different. In the first place, lots of people working in it are now going to be exposed to the sort of economic cycles of the modern, or what we might think of as sort of the modern economy, where things can happen quickly, you don't necessarily see them coming, they're not sort of predictable in the way that oftentimes sort of the agricultural year can be. People now live in a sort of a boom or bust economy. And because they're simply working in a factory, they don't have access to a lot of information about, what's the demand for goods, what's going on overseas, what are the prices of raw materials. You can be working one day, you could be out on the street the next, with no warning. But more than that sort of instability, which not a lot of people experienced in the 1840s, 50s, up until the American Civil War, cuts off supplies of cotton, and then you get massive unemployment in parts of Britain. You have, instead, this other sort of dislocation, which is that your relationship to your work. You don't work sort of the day by the rhythms of the day. You work a certain number of hours. If there's one technology that perhaps, I think, exemplifies industrialization, it's not the steam engine. I think it's the clock. Because industrialization ultimately is based on time. It's based on efficiency and productivity, which is ultimately based on time. How much of a certain good can you produce in a certain time? That is, everything else, the cost of the good, the price at which it's going to be sold, the wages paid, are based on the productivity. Production over time. Efficiency of production as measured in time. People's lives are now governed by the clock. You punch in, you punch out. You don't work until you have produced a certain number of goods, as you might have were you sort of a hand-loom weaver or a pre-industrial artisan. Instead, you work at a machine, or you maintain a machine, or you load and unload things for a certain number of hours. And you're paid by the hour. You're not paid by the piece. You're not paid by the good that's produced. You're paid by the hour, and that's factored into productivity. How much can be made in a factory in an hour? at what price can you put these that will allow you to pay wages and still make a profit. Time dominates. It's not simply that time dominates sort of the working day, but time dominates everything. You cannot have a modern transport infrastructure. You can't have railways without clocks. The entire industrial process is based on a series of deliveries, usually by railway. Deliveries of raw materials, outward shipments of finished goods. Industrialization depends on this sort of fine balance. You have to know when the raw materials are coming. You have to know how much you're getting, so that your factory can run at full capacity without getting either sort of, overwhelmed with raw materials, or seeing sort of a growing store of finished goods pile up. Either way, that slows down the process. The idea is to keep the factory moving. You have just enough coal, just enough cotton arriving at all times to be produced into a certain, or to be made into a certain number of goods, which can be removed equally efficiently. You need schedules, you need times. You have it's the railways that in this country bring about time zones. You can't have people making up their own time of day. Well, it's 3 o'clock here, but across the street it's 4:45, and you know that. You have to have standardized time so that you can organize things like railway timetables. So you can deliver passengers and you can deliver goods. So what changes for people is really that not just their sort of relationship to the day, but their relationship to the entire concept of time. Work is now measured in time worked, not in goods produced. Productivity is measured in time. The entire sort of infrastructure of industry is based on time. And as I've said, because of the productivity, because of the efficiency, people will make money. People working in British factories in the 1830s, 40s, 50s will experience, for many of them, an unexpected and perhaps unseen level of prosperity. But it's not going to be without cost. The massive migration to cities, the transformation of people's relationship to work is going to be really dislocated. It's not perhaps going to be as dislocating as people like Dickens and Blake see it, but it is going to be significant. What I want to talk about next time is how that sort of impression of industrialization, of both sort of the way in which people work and the way in which people relate to their work, how that is picked up and transformed into a new sort of political idea. That is, the way that industrialization ultimately comes to produce the dominant, or the sort of the novel, and ultimately very sort of influential political idea in the 19th century that's known as socialism. So we will turn next time to sort of the relationship between industrialization and socialism. Remember, if you weren't here earlier, you can see